Case 1. Susan Smith. For 9 days, a young mother in South Carolina looked into the news cameras and begged a stranger to bring her 2 little boys home. The entire country believed her. What almost nobody suspected was that the man who supposedly took them had never existed at all, and that the woman weeping on camera already knew exactly where her children were. Susan Lee Smith was 23 years old in the autumn of 1994. She lived in the small mill town of Union, South Carolina, working at a company where she had started an affair with the son of the owner, a man named Tom Findley. Her marriage was already falling apart, and then Findley wrote her a letter, ending things. He told her plainly that he was not ready to be a father to someone else's children. To most people, that would be heartbreak. To Susan, according to what prosecutors later argued, it became a problem with a solution. On the night of October 25th, she drove to a boat ramp at a quiet lake called John D. Long Lake. In the back seat, strapped into their car seats, were her sons. Michael was 3 years old. Alexander was just 14 months, barely more than a baby. Susan put the car in neutral, stepped out, and let it roll down the ramp into the black water. It took about 6 minutes for the car to fill and sink. She stood there and let it happen. Then she ran to a nearby house, sobbing, and told a story that would grip the nation. Her story was this: a man had jumped into her car at a red light, pointed a gun at her, and driven off with her boys still inside. For 9 days that lie held. Susan and her estranged husband David appeared on national television, pleading for the safe return of the children. Prayer vigils were held, volunteers searched. Photographs of 2 smiling little boys ran on every network, and the whole time, the truth was sitting at the bottom of a lake, 5 miles from her home. Investigators had doubts almost from the start. The details of her carjacking did not line up. The intersection where she claimed it happened made no sense for the traffic signal she described. The friend she said she had been driving to visit had not been home. Sheriff Howard Wells and state agents kept her talking, day after day, gently pulling at the threads until the whole thing unravelled. On November 3rd, inside a local church, Susan Smith finally wrote out a confession and signed it. That same evening, divers went into the lake and found the car, upside down, with both boys still inside. The nation's grief turned to fury almost overnight. Part of what made people so angry was the lie itself. For 9 days she had pointed the finger at an invented stranger, and innocent people in the community had been pulled in and questioned over a crime that had never taken place. That invented figure had sent officers searching, had put a whole region on edge, and had cast suspicion on men who matched nothing but a description she had made up. She had used a man who did not exist to hide what she had done to her own sons. Her trial began the following summer in Union. The defence did not deny that she had caused the deaths. Instead, her lawyers argued that Susan was a deeply damaged woman, that she suffered from depression, and that the drownings were a suicide attempt gone wrong, that she had meant to go into the water with the boys and lost her nerve. The prosecution painted a colder picture. To them, this was a woman who saw her own children as the obstacle standing between her and the wealthy man she wanted, and who removed that obstacle. In the summer of 1995, the jury found her guilty of 2 counts of murder. They spared her the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison, with a chance at parole only after she had served 30 years. For decades, that number, 30 years, felt almost theoretical. And then it arrived. In November of 2024, Susan Smith sat in front of a parole board for the first time and asked to be set free. She spoke about God forgiving her. She said she would give anything to go back and change that night. Her former husband, David, the father of Michael and Alexander, sat in that room and asked the board to keep her exactly where she was. He came to that hearing wearing a small pin with the faces of his 2 boys. The board pointed to the sheer seriousness of what she had done and to a prison record that had not been clean, and they turned her down, unanimously. Under the law, she can try again every 2 years, which means this is a name that will keep returning to the news for a long time to come. Even now, she insists she only ever meant to hurt herself. The courts did not believe it then. Michael and Alexander were 3 years old and 14 months old, and they trusted the one person a child is supposed to trust most in the world. Some of these mothers built elaborate stories to hide what they had done. The next one built hers on a rural road in Oregon, with a bullet wound in her own arm and a tale about a stranger in the dark, and she nearly got away with it, until one of the children she had shot woke up and started to talk. Case 2. Diane Downs. In 1983, a woman raced into an Oregon emergency room, screaming that a stranger had shot her 3 children. Doctors found one of them already gone, and the other 2 barely clinging to life. The mother had a wound of her own. For weeks, the town hunted a bushy-haired stranger who did not exist, until the little girl in the hospital bed began to remember who had really been holding the gun. Elizabeth Diane Downs was 27 years old, a postal worker living near Springfield, Oregon. On the night of May 19, 1983, she pulled up to a hospital emergency entrance driving slowly. Inside the car were her 3 children, all of them gravely hurt. 7-year-old Cheryl was already dead. 8-year-old Christy and 3-year-old Danny were fighting for their lives. Downs herself had been shot in the left forearm. Her account was dramatic. She said a man with shaggy, bushy hair had flagged her down on a lonely country road, tried to take her car, and opened fire when she resisted, hitting all 3 children and her before she managed to speed away. It was the kind of random nightmare that frightens every parent, and for a while, investigators went looking for that stranger. The story had problems from the beginning. A witness said Downs had been driving to the hospital at a crawl, barely 10 miles an hour, not the frantic escape you would expect from a mother whose children were bleeding beside her. Her own manner was strange. Detectives and hospital staff noticed she was oddly flat, unemotional, almost calm. Her arm wound looked more like something self-inflicted than the work of a panicked attacker, and when they looked into her life, a motive came into focus. Downs was involved with a married man, and that man had made it clear he did not want a woman with 3 children. Her private diaries laid the obsession bare. Investigators also noticed what was missing. The weapon that fired the shots was never found at the scene, though her former husband said she owned exactly that kind of small caliber pistol and had brought it with her to Oregon. Everything about the physical evidence pointed inward, toward the driver, rather than outward, toward a phantom on the roadside. Then came the moment that broke the case wide open. Christy, the 8-year-old, had survived, but the shooting had caused a stroke that stole her speech for a time. Slowly, through months of therapy, she recovered, and when investigators gently asked her who had shot her that night, she did not describe a stranger. She said it was her mother. Prosecutor Fred Hughey built the case around that unbearable truth, that the children had been shot by the one person driving the car. Danny, the youngest, would never walk again. The shooting had left him paralysed from the waist down, a 3-year-old facing the rest of his life in a wheelchair because of the woman who was supposed to protect him. In June of 1984, a jury convicted her of murder, of 2 counts of attempted murder, and of assault. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. There was one more grotesque wrinkle. Downs had been pregnant during the trial, and she gave birth to a daughter shortly before sentencing. That baby was placed for adoption and raised by another family, far away from the woman who had shot her older siblings. It was a chilling piece of timing, a new life beginning even as the case against her was sealed. Downs was not done making headlines. In 1987, only 3 years into her sentence, she escaped from a prison in Oregon. She was free for 10 days before police tracked her down at the home of another inmate's husband and put her back behind bars. For security, she was eventually moved to California, where she remains. She has never once admitted what she did. For 4 decades, she has insisted the bushy-haired stranger was real and that she is an innocent woman wrongly caged. She has filed petitions claiming her conviction was flawed. Parole boards have heard her out again and again, and again and again they have said no. Most recently, late in 2025, calling her exactly what the evidence showed her to be, a continuing danger. Her surviving children were adopted by the very prosecutor who convicted her and his wife, and they built quiet lives out of her reach. The little boy she left paralysed, and the daughter whose speech she had stolen, grew up in a home that had nothing to do with the woman who gave birth to them, and they have almost never spoken publicly about her since. The case became one of the most famous in American true crime, the subject of a best-selling book by one of the most famous crime writers in the country, and a television film that reached millions. Strip away the invented stranger and the prison escape, and what lingers is a little girl in a hospital bed, relearning how to speak, and the first words she managed being the name of the mother who had tried to kill her. Diane Downs at least pretended to be a grieving parent. The woman in the next case did not bother with a stranger or a cover story. When police reached her Florida home, she was sitting on the back porch, and the only explanation she offered was that her teenagers had been talking back. If you need to know how these stories end, subscribe. It is free, and it tells us to keep pulling cases like this out of the archives. Case 3. Julie Shenecker. There is a difference between a killing that explodes out of nowhere and one that is planned on a calendar. What happened in this Florida home was the second kind. Days before her 2 teenagers died, their mother drove almost 30 miles to buy the gun, complained in writing that she could not stand the wait, and marked the date. She even gave the plan a name. Julie Powers Shenecker was 50 years old, a former Army linguist living in a comfortable neighborhood in Tampa, Florida. Her husband, an Army colonel, was deployed overseas. She had struggled for years with severe depression and bipolar disorder. She had once been trained in language and intelligence work, a woman who, by any outside measure, had built a stable, accomplished life. Her husband was away serving his country when everything came apart at home. What happened in the last week of January in 2011 had been planned well in advance, and she wrote much of it down. 5 days before the killings, Shenecker went to buy a handgun, a .38 caliber revolver. Florida law required a waiting period, and in her journal she raged about it, writing that she could not stand having to wait. When the waiting period ended, she picked up the weapon and the ammunition to go with it. In that same notebook, she described what she intended to do. She wrote about a Saturday massacre. She wrote that the evil would start on a Thursday. She even recorded which of her children she would kill first. There is no colder evidence of intent than a person writing down in advance the order in which their own children will die. On the 27th of January, she carried it out. Her 13-year-old son, Beau, was in the family vehicle, on the way to soccer practice when she shot him. Then she drove back to the house, went to where her 16-year-old daughter, Calix, was sitting at a computer doing homework, and shot her as well. When officers arrived, they found Shenecker on the back porch, dazed and unresponsive. Inside, investigators recovered the notebook where she had mapped it all out, page after page describing her intentions in her own hand. A forensic analyst would later match the blood on the robe she was wearing to both of her children. Her explanation for it all was almost unbearable in how small it was. She said her children had become mouthy, they talked back, and for that, she said, they had to go. Her defense at trial was insanity. Her lawyers argued that her mental illness had reached a point where she could not tell right from wrong, that she was not responsible for her actions in any legal sense. It is a defense that sometimes succeeds in cases like this. It did not succeed here. 3 mental health experts called by the prosecution testified that whatever her diagnosis, Julie Shenecker had known exactly what she was doing and had known that it was wrong. The prosecutor laid out the gun purchase, the complaint about waiting, the journal, the chosen order of the killings, and argued that these were deliberate, well-planned, well-concealed homicides, not the confusion of a broken mind. The trial itself stretched across weeks in a Tampa courtroom, with experts on both sides describing a woman who was undeniably ill. The question the jury had to answer was narrower than that. Not whether she was troubled, but whether she had understood, in the moment she pulled the trigger, that killing her children was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They rejected the insanity defense and found her guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. Jurors said afterward that it was the journal, her own words, planning it all out in advance, that removed any doubt. In the spring of 2014, she was sentenced to 2 life terms in prison with no possibility of parole. She has tried since then to win a new trial, blaming her attorneys and arguing that the intense local coverage had made a fair trial impossible. Every attempt has failed. Higher courts have refused to disturb the verdict, and she remains in a Florida prison, serving 2 life sentences that will not end. Her husband divorced her within months of the murders. He has spent the years since trying to keep his children's memory alive, rather than the name of the woman who took them, speaking about who Calix and Beau were, rather than how they died. He pursued a civil claim over their deaths, and worked to build something in their memory, a way of making sure the last word on his children was not their mother's crime. That is the quiet tragedy underneath the paperwork. 2 teenagers, one on his way to a soccer game, one doing her homework, killed by a mother who had written down her plan and complained only that she had needed to wait a few days to buy the gun. There is a particular horror in premeditation, in the calendar and the shopping trip and the chosen order. The next mother's plan was smaller and faster. One terrible day of drinking and rage, but she made sure of it in a way that is hard to speak about. She shot all 4 of her sons, and she stopped in the middle to reload. Case 4. Susan Eubanks. One October afternoon in 1997, a woman in California spent the day drinking and arguing with the men who had left her. By nightfall, all 4 of her sons were dead. What makes this case sit so heavily is a single, deliberate detail from the investigation. Somewhere in the middle of killing her own children, she ran out of bullets, and she calmly stopped to load more. Susan Diane Eubanks was 33 years old, living in a small home in San Marcos in San Diego County, California. Her life had come apart. Her marriage had failed. She was drowning in debt, and the relationships she had with the men in her life were collapsing one after another. On the 26th of October, 1997, she spent the day drinking and taking tranquilizers. She argued bitterly with her boyfriend, and at one point went out and cut his tires. Her estranged husband came by. Everything that could go wrong in a person's life seemed to be going wrong in hers at once, and she decided to make the people who had hurt her feel it forever. In the house that day were her 4 sons. Brandon was 14, Austin was 7, Brigham was 6, Matthew, the baby, was 4 years old. Over the course of that evening, Eubanks took a revolver and shot all 4 of them. The detail that investigators would never shake, the detail that turns this from a tragedy into something colder, is that the weapon did not hold enough rounds to do it all at once. Partway through, she stopped, reloaded the gun, and continued. When it was over, she turned the gun on herself, but she survived. Her children did not. When help arrived, the scene told its own story. The oldest boy was found in the living room. The 3 younger ones were together in a bedroom. A 5th child in the house that day, a young nephew in her care, was left unharmed, the one small mercy in a home full of loss. This was not a delusion, it was revenge. She had left a voicemail for her estranged husband, telling him, in effect, to say goodbye. She left notes behind. In one of them, she told the father of 2 of the boys that he had betrayed her, that she had lost everyone she had ever loved, and that now it was his turn to feel the same loss. She was punishing the men who had left her by destroying the thing that would wound them most, the children they shared. Deputies found 5 notes in all scattered on her bedroom floor, every one of them written in her own hand, a set of goodbyes and accusations aimed at the men she blamed. At her sentencing, she would even frame it as a twisted act of love, saying her boys were better off gone. It was the logic of a person who had decided that, if she could not have a happy life, no one connected to her would be allowed to keep theirs either. The jury did not see mercy in any of it. They convicted Susan Eubanks of 4 counts of first-degree murder, and they found the special circumstance that lifts a case into its most serious category, that she had committed multiple murders. The jury needed only about 2 hours to return those guilty verdicts, and after a separate penalty phase, it recommended a sentence of death. In 1999, that sentence was formally imposed. For years, she sat on California's death row, one of only a small number of women there, and the state's highest court upheld her sentence. Then the ground shifted. California placed a moratorium on executions, meaning the death sentences on its books were no longer being carried out. Eubanks had also filed petitions challenging her original conviction in state and federal court, the kind of long, grinding appeals that can force a county to relitigate a decades-old horror in front of a new jury. To spare the boy's surviving family from ever having to sit through that again, the San Diego District Attorney agreed to a resolution. In October of 2024, a judge formally resentenced Susan Eubanks. She came off death row, but not toward freedom. Her new sentence is life in prison with no possibility of parole. The district attorney put it plainly that the agreement was guaranteed to keep this murderer behind bars for the rest of her life. For a family that had waited nearly 3 decades, the resentencing closed a door that had been left open far too long. So the outcome is the same as a locked door thrown into the sea. She will die in prison. But the change in her sentence, nearly 30 years after the crime, dragged the names back into the news. Brandon, Austin, Brigham and Matthew. 14, 7, 6 and 4. 4 boys who should be grown men now, with lives and families of their own. A mother so consumed with wounding the men who left her that she reloaded a weapon rather than let a single one of her sons survive. Everything so far has involved a gun, or a lie, or a lake. The next case is quieter in the telling, and for many people harder to hear, because the victim was only weeks old, and because of the ordinary kitchen appliance her mother used to end her life. Subscribe if you want the next one to find you on its own. It costs nothing, and it is what keeps this channel putting these cases together. Case 5, China Arnold. This one is hard to say out loud, so we will say it once, plainly, and then move to how she was caught. In 2005, in Dayton, Ohio, a mother ended the life of her 28-day-old daughter using the microwave in her own kitchen. It took investigators years and 3 separate trials to prove what had happened inside that apartment. China Arnold was 25 years old and lived in Dayton, Ohio, with her boyfriend and her 3 young sons. She was not a stranger to trouble. She had prior convictions for abduction and for forgery. On the night of August 30th, 2005, she had been out drinking, and when she got home, an argument started with her boyfriend. The argument was about the baby, about whether he was really the father of their infant daughter, Paris, who was just 28 days old. Sometime in the hours that followed, Arnold placed that 4-week-old baby inside the microwave oven and turned it on. The next morning, she and her boyfriend brought Paris to the hospital, but there was nothing anyone could do. At first, the cause of death was a mystery. It took the medical examiner's work to establish what had truly happened, that the baby had been exposed to the intense heat of a microwave. A forensic pathologist would later testify that the infant's body temperature had climbed to a level no living child could survive, and that she had most likely been inside the running appliance for more than 2 minutes. It was the kind of finding that only forensic science could uncover, and it became the backbone of the case. Once it was understood, the investigation turned toward the one adult who had been alone with the child. Arnold was arrested, but early on there was not enough to hold her, and she was released while investigators kept building the case. It would be more than a year before she was charged, and even then, proving it in court was another matter entirely. This became one of the most drawn-out child murder prosecutions in Ohio history. It took 3 trials. The first ended in a mistrial when new witnesses came forward at the last moment. The second produced a guilty verdict, but an appeals court threw that conviction out, ruling that prosecutors had crossed a line and that a witness who should have been allowed to testify for the defense had been wrongly kept off the stand. So the state tried a 3rd time. Along the way, the defense argued that Arnold had been drunk, that there was no clear motive, and even suggested that suspicion could point elsewhere, toward the boyfriend. A jailhouse informant who once claimed Arnold had confessed later took that claim back. The road to a conviction was so tangled that at times it looked as though no verdict would ever hold. Through all of it, the forensic reality held. In May of 2011, at that 3rd trial, a jury again found China Arnold guilty of aggravated murder. The jurors deliberated across parts of 2 days before returning that verdict. In that courtroom, the crime was condemned as heinous, a word the prosecution returned to again and again. Arnold was spared the death penalty when the jury could not reach agreement on it, but she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole. At that sentencing, Arnold declined to say anything at all. Higher courts, including the state's Supreme Court, would later refuse to disturb the 3rd conviction. Psychologists who examined her had found no sign of serious mental illness. She had understood what she was doing. She also had 3 older sons at home, children who had lived in that same small apartment, which made the choice she made with the youngest even harder to fathom. To this day, she maintains that she is innocent, that she did not do it at all. The method is almost impossible to think about, but what makes the case land even harder is the ordinariness of the setting. A kitchen, an appliance in nearly every home in the country. A 28-day-old baby who had been alive for less than a month, caught in the middle of an adult argument about who her father was. She had been in the world just long enough to be named, held, and fed, and not much longer. Paris Talley never got the chance to be anything other than the centre of that fight. Only one other case like it, an earlier one involving a microwave, had ever been recorded in the United States, and in that instance a court accepted that the death was a genuine, tragic accident during a medical seizure. Arnold's case was different. 3 juries worth of scrutiny, 3 trials, and a forensic finding that would not go away, all landed on the same conclusion. This was no accident. So far these have been mothers acting alone, in the heat of a single night, or the grip of one obsession. The next case widens out into something far harder to comprehend, because this time there was more than one child, and far more than one night. 6 infants, killed over the span of a decade, hidden away in a garage that a father would one day open with no idea what he was about to find. Case 6. Megan Huntsman. In a quiet, tidy neighbourhood in Utah, a man came home to clean out the garage of the house he used to share with his family. In a cardboard box, he found the body of a baby. Then he found another. By the time the police were finished, they had counted 7, and the woman responsible had kept that garage locked around its secret for nearly 20 years. Megan Huntsman was in her late 30s, a mother living in Pleasant Grove, Utah, a small, mostly quiet community south of Salt Lake City. On the surface, there was nothing to mark her out, but across roughly a decade, between the middle of the 1990s and the middle of the 2000s, Huntsman gave birth in her own home again and again, and each time she killed the newborn within moments of its first breath. She then wrapped the tiny bodies, placed them in boxes, and stacked them in the garage, where they stayed, hidden, for years. At least one of those births happened with other family members elsewhere in the house, unaware that a child had just been born and killed a few rooms away. The truth surfaced in April of 2014. Her estranged husband, Darren West, had just been released after serving an 8-year prison term of his own on drug charges. He returned to the Pleasant Grove home they had once shared to gather some belongings and clean out the garage. Inside a box, he found what he thought was a dead infant, and he called the police. When investigators arrived and searched, the count kept climbing. In total, they recovered 7 tiny bodies. 6 of them had been born alive and then killed. The 7th, authorities determined, had been stillborn. Later testing confirmed that Darren West was the biological father of all 7 infants. He had been in prison for much of the relevant period and was never considered a suspect. This was Megan Huntsman's secret alone. When police questioned her, she did not hide behind confusion or claim she did not know what had happened. She told them she had killed each newborn right after giving birth. Her explanation for why was chillingly practical. She said she had been in the grip of drug addiction, that she had not wanted the children, and that she did not want the responsibility of raising them. The people who investigated the case had spent careers around terrible things, and even they struggled to describe it. One police captain said it was completely selfish, that she had simply been high and had not wanted the babies or the burden of them. The county attorney who prosecuted her did not reach for the language of madness or breakdown. He called the killings cold and calculated, and described Huntsman as remarkably, almost unbelievably indifferent. There was nothing confused or delusional about what she had done. She made the same choice, in the same way, over and over, across 10 years, and then went on with her life, while the evidence sat a few feet from where she parked her car. She did not fight the charges. In February of 2015, standing in a Utah courtroom, Megan Huntsman pleaded guilty. She answered the same words 6 times, once for each of the babies she had killed, admitting to 6 counts of first-degree murder. She raised no mental health defense. In a statement to the court, she said that she had deprived her little babies of the chance to live, and that they were never coming back because of what she had done. In April of 2015, a judge sentenced her. For each of the 6 murders, she received a term of 5 years to life. The judge ordered 3 of those terms to be served one after another, stacking them, which pushed her earliest possible release far into the future. The math is stark. Her first opportunity to even ask a parole board for freedom will not come until the year 2064, by which point she would be nearly 90 years old. The prosecutor said plainly that he did not believe she would ever be released. The detectives who worked the case had seen the worst that people do to one another, and they described this one as emotionally draining, a discovery that shook even long-time officers. Huntsman herself gave no real explanation. She had kept the secret for the better part of 2 decades, offering the court little beyond the addiction that had gripped her at the time. There is a particular kind of horror in this case that is different from the others. There was no single night of rage, no gunshot, no lie told to television cameras. There was only a pattern, repeated in secret, in an ordinary house on an ordinary street, hidden so completely that even the man who fathered the children had no idea for almost 2 decades. 6 infants, each alive for only minutes, killed by the one person on earth who was supposed to protect them, and then stored away like something to be forgotten. The next mother did not hide her children in a garage. She kept them in the house with her, behind a locked door, long after they were gone. And when the authorities finally forced their way inside, what they found would shake an entire city and cost a string of officials their jobs. Quick thing before the next name. If these deep dives are worth your time, subscribing is free, and it is the biggest way you help us keep making them. Case 7. Bonita Jacks. When federal marshals forced open the door of a Washington row house to carry out an eviction, they were not expecting to become witnesses to a homicide. Inside, they found 4 girls who had been dead for months. Their mother had gone on living in the house alongside them, and when she finally stood before a court, she would insist her daughters had not been killed at all, that something had taken them. Bonita Jacks was in her early 30s, living in the Washington Highlands neighborhood of the nation's capital. She had 4 daughters. Brittany was the oldest, around 16. Then came Tatiana, who was 11, Nakia, who was 6, and little Aja, who was 5. For a time they had been an ordinary struggling family. Then, early in 2007, the father of the 2 youngest girls died of cancer, and something in Bonita Jacks came loose. She pulled the children out of school. She cut off contact with relatives and neighbours. She turned the home into a sealed world, with only herself in charge of it. Over the summer of 2007, inside that closed house, all 4 girls died. The details of exactly how are difficult, because by the time anyone found them, months had passed. What investigators pieced together was a picture of children who had been isolated, deprived, and ultimately killed. The 3 youngest had most likely been killed deliberately. The oldest, Brittany, had died of other injuries. In the months that followed, warning signs had flickered and been missed. A school social worker had raised the alarm about the children more than once. But no one ever forced the door, and the girls stayed lost inside it. That door was finally opened on the 9th of January 2008. United States Marshals arrived to evict the family, and when they went inside, they found the bodies. 3 of the girls had been placed together in one upstairs bedroom. The eldest was in another. Their mother was arrested at the scene. So little was known about the girls' short lives that when it came time to speak for them in court, there was almost nothing to say. No family member stood up to describe who they had been. Their personalities, their small joys, the ordinary details of 4 childhoods had all but vanished along with them. From the beginning, Bonita Jacks was a defendant unlike most. Her lawyers wanted to pursue an insanity defense, and given what she told investigators, it was an obvious path. She claimed her daughters had become possessed by demons, and that they had simply died in their sleep no matter what she did to save them. But Jacks refused to let her attorneys argue insanity. She waived her right to a jury and put her fate entirely in the hands of a single judge. That judge, Frederick Weisberg, heard the case himself in a bench trial, a rare choice in a murder case of this magnitude. He convicted Bonita Jacks of 4 counts of felony murder, 1 for each girl. He also found her guilty of premeditated first-degree murder in the deaths of the 3 youngest. The children, he could conclude, had been deliberately killed. On the oldest daughter, Brittany, He acquitted her of premeditated murder because so much time had passed before the girls were found that it was impossible to be certain, beyond a reasonable doubt, exactly how she had died. It is a chilling technicality that a mother could be found not guilty on one specific charge only because her child had been left too long to say for sure. He convicted her as well of child cruelty toward all four. In December of 2009, Judge Weisberg sentenced Bonita Jacks to 120 years in prison. He imposed 30-year terms for the girls and ordered them served one after another rather than together, which is the difference between a real sentence and a symbolic one. The prosecutor told the court that these children had been betrayed by the one person on earth who was supposed to protect all of us, their mother. The aftershock did not stop at the courtroom. The city had failed these girls, and everyone could see it. A social worker had knocked, a police officer had visited, school officials had raised concerns, and still 4 children had died behind a door that no one forced open in time. Within days of the discovery, the mayor of Washington fired 6 employees of the city's Child and Family Services Agency. Investigations followed, and so did reform. New rules required workers to actually lay eyes on a child before a case could be closed. Agreements were struck with schools to report children who vanished from the rolls. Laws were changed to let agencies share information they had once kept walled off from one another. It was the grim, familiar pattern of child protection in America, a system that rewrites itself only after it is already too late. Bonita Jacks remains in prison, where she will stay for the rest of her life. 4 daughters, ages 5 to 16, sealed inside their own home by the person meant to keep them safe. The next case moves from a house full of silence to something far more public. This mother did not hide her child away. She put his suffering on display for the whole internet to see, and thousands of strangers cheered her on as a devoted parent, never once guessing what she was doing to him when the cameras were off. Case 8. Lacy Spears. To the thousands of people who followed her online, she looked like a devoted young mother, nursing a chronically sick little boy through one hospital stay after another. She wrote about his illnesses in loving, tender detail. What none of her followers understood was that those illnesses had a single source, and that the source was sitting right beside his hospital bed, updating her blog. Lacy Spears was in her mid-20s, a single mother who had moved around the country before landing in Chestnut Ridge, New York. Her son, Garnet Paul, was 5 years old. For nearly his entire life, he had been sick in ways that baffled doctors, and he had been fitted with a feeding tube when he was still an infant. To the outside world, Lacy was the picture of maternal devotion. She chronicled every hospital visit, every scare, every setback across a blog and her social media accounts, and a following grew around her. Strangers who prayed for the brave little boy and praised the mother who never left his side. She had come up from the south and settled with Garnet in a close-knit spiritual community, and everywhere she went, the story of her sick little boy went with her. In January of 2014, Garnet was admitted to the hospital again. This time his sodium levels climbed to a point that had no medical explanation. Doctors were alarmed. He had come in around the middle of the month, and within days his sodium had spiked to a level that clinicians rarely see and that a body cannot reach on its own. As his condition worsened, he was rushed to a larger regional medical centre, where the specialists fighting to save him could find no natural cause for what was happening to his blood. Over the days that followed, his condition collapsed, and on the 23rd of January 2014, Garnet Paul died. He was 5 years old. What the doctors had begun to suspect, and what investigators would go on to prove, was that the salt in Garnet's body had been put there deliberately. Prosecutors said Lacy Spears had been pushing heavy concentrations of sodium through the very feeding tube that was meant to keep him alive. Hospital surveillance footage captured her taking the boy into a bathroom, away from the eyes of the medical staff. When investigators examined one of his feeding bags, it held a level of sodium far beyond anything that belonged in a child's body. The motive prosecutors laid out was as disturbing as the method. She had made her son sick and kept him sick for the attention and sympathy it brought her, the outpouring of concern she documented so carefully online. None of this had begun in that final hospital stay. The pattern of unexplained illness had stretched back through most of Garnet's short life. chronicled in his mother's own posts even as doctors searched for a cause they would never find in his body. The salt she pushed into him drove his sodium to a level his small body could not survive, overwhelming a 5-year-old boy with something no one at his bedside could see or stop. The clinical name for that pattern is a condition in which a caregiver deliberately harms someone in their care in order to draw attention to themselves. It is a diagnosis that hovered over the entire case. But in an unusual decision, both the prosecution and the defense agreed not to raise it at trial. The disorder was never offered to the jury as an excuse or an explanation. Spears was tried simply as a mother who had poisoned her child. Her trial lasted about 2 weeks. In March of 2015, the jury found Lacy Spears guilty of second-degree murder under a theory of depraved indifference to human life. One prosecutor told the court that Spears had used her son's feeding tube as a weapon to kill him, and that Garnett should have been in school, alive, instead of gone. In April, the judge sentenced her to 20 years to life. He could have gone higher, and the prosecution had asked him to, but he pointed to her apparent mental illness, even as he called the crime unfathomable in its cruelty. He said, in essence, that he was showing her the mercy she had never shown her son. Through all of it, she sat and showed almost no emotion. Her conviction was upheld on appeal, and the state's highest court declined to disturb it. She remains behind bars in New York. The case became one of the first widely known examples of this kind of harm playing out in the age of social media, a mother building an audience out of her child's decline, gathering comfort from strangers with every update, while the child himself grew sicker by her hand. It would be picked apart for years afterward, in articles and television programs, held up as a warning about how easily a caregiver can hide harm behind the mask of devotion. There is something uniquely cold about this one. The other mothers here acted in private, in cars and kitchens and locked houses. Lacy Spears performed her devotion in public, in real time, for an audience, and used that performance as cover for what she was doing when no one was looking. The people who followed her believed they were watching a mother fight for her son. They were watching the opposite. If you have come this far with us, do one small thing and subscribe. It is free, and every single subscriber makes the next investigation possible. Case 9. Kenisha Berry. A couple searching a dumpster behind a Texas apartment complex for cans found a newborn baby boy bound with tape and sealed inside a trash bag. No one knew who he was, so they gave him a name themselves, Baby Hope. For 5 long years, that name was all anyone could offer him, until a second abandoned infant, this one still alive, finally cracked the whole thing open. The discovery came in late November of 1998 in Beaumont, Texas. A husband and wife named Roy and Ima Black, out collecting aluminium cans, opened a dumpster and found the body of a baby boy. He had been bound with duct tape and placed inside a black plastic trash bag. Ima was the one who gave him the name Baby Hope, and it stuck, because for years that was all he had. The medical examiner determined that the infant had been alive when he was sealed into that bag, and ruled the death a homicide by suffocation. That finding turned a heartbreaking discovery into a murder investigation. The medical examiner also noted that in his 4 days of life, the baby had been fed only twice. But there was no name, no mother, and no obvious lead. The case went cold. Then, in the summer of 2003, nearly 5 years later, a second baby was found abandoned near Beaumont. A newborn girl had been left in a roadside ditch, covered in fire ants, badly hurt but alive. She was left in critical condition, and she spent about a month in the hospital before she pulled through. Investigators working to identify her found their way to a woman named Kenisha Berry, and as they looked at Berry, an old, unsolved case began to stir. She led investigators to the very spot where she had discarded the abandoned girl's wrappings, and it was the same trash bin where Baby Hope had been found 5 years before. Kenisha Berry was, on paper, an unlikely suspect. She had worked in childcare, and she had no prior criminal record, but she had a habit that investigators found revealing. She kept the children she had with one particular man, and got rid of the newborns fathered by others, hiding those pregnancies entirely, delivering in secret while her older children were away. She had given birth to Malachi at home, alone, and when her other children came back and found a baby in the apartment, She told them she was simply looking after an infant for a friend. When detectives compared the physical evidence from the 1998 dumpster case to Berry, the pieces fell into place. A fingerprint on the duct tape matched her hand, and genetic testing confirmed that she was Baby Hope's mother. Baby Hope finally had a name. He was Malachi. In February of 2004, a Beaumont jury convicted Kenisha Berry of capital murder for the death of Malachi. The abandonment of the second baby, the little girl left in the ditch, was brought in to show the jury a pattern, to demonstrate that this had not been a single desperate act, but a repeated one. The jury sentenced Berry to death, making her one of only a small number of women on the state's death row. But the story did not end there. In 2007, the highest criminal court in Texas took up her appeal. The judges did not question that Berry had killed her son. What they questioned was the death sentence itself. Under Texas law, a jury sending someone to death row must find that the person poses a continuing danger to society in the future. Berry's lawyers argued there was not enough evidence of that. She had no prior record, and experts said she posed a low risk of future violence, especially inside a prison. The court agreed. It upheld the conviction but threw out the death sentence and reformed it to life in prison. That was a rare reversal in Texas, a state that carries out more executions than any other. One judge, writing for the majority, acknowledged the horror of one dead infant and another abandoned in a ditch, but concluded that the law simply did not support a finding of future dangerousness in this case. So Kenisha Berry did not die by execution. She remains in the Texas prison system, serving a life term. The little girl she left in the ditch survived, scarred by the ant bites but alive, and was placed into the care of others. She grew up carrying the weight of how she came into the world. What makes this case linger is the coldness of the arithmetic behind it. There was no rage here and no breakdown, nothing hot about it at all. What the evidence showed was a sorting. Some children were kept. Others, the ones connected to the wrong man, were treated as things to be hidden and thrown away, delivered in secret and disposed of like refuse. Malachi Berry lived 4 days. He was given a name by a stranger who found him in the trash before he was ever given one by the woman who bore him. The final case is the oldest, and it may be the most haunting of them all, because this time the toll climbs all the way to 9. 9 small graves spread across more than a decade, and a mother who stood at every single one of them. Case 10. Mary Beth Tinning. Over the course of 14 years, a mother in upstate New York buried 9 of her own children. One, and then another, and then another, until nearly a decade and a half had passed, and the whole family was gone. For a long time, doctors and neighbours accepted it as a run of unimaginable bad luck, a household cursed by some hidden illness in the blood. It was only when the last child died that anyone finally asked the question out loud. Mary Beth Tinning lived in Schenectady, New York, with her husband, a factory worker who was never implicated in any of what followed. Between 1972 and 1985, 9 of the couple's children died young, most of them as infants. To the people around them, they looked like an unlucky, church-going family, nothing more. In the beginning, each death was written off to natural causes: crib death, sudden infant death syndrome, the vague possibility of a genetic disorder that ran in the family and struck the babies down one after another. One of the children who died had actually been adopted, which quietly demolished the theory that some inherited illness was to blame, because that child shared none of her blood. It seemed almost too cruel to question. Who would suspect a grieving mother of anything but grief, once, let alone 9 times over? By the time the last child died, some of the local doctors and pathologists who had seen the family's babies come through their hospitals had quietly grown suspicious, though no charges had yet been brought. But the sheer number of deaths eventually became impossible to ignore. When the youngest, a 4-month-old daughter named Tammy Lynn, died in December of 1985, a laboratory test pointed to suffocation. That finding was the thread that finally unravelled everything. Investigators brought Mary Beth Tinning in for questioning, and under that questioning she signed a statement. She admitted that she had killed Tammy Lynn. She also admitted to ending the lives of 2 of her sons years earlier. After more than a decade of quiet burials, the mother at the centre of them all had finally said the words. Prosecutors indicted her in 3 of the deaths, but in the end they chose to try her for only one, the death of Tammy Lynn, the case where the physical evidence was strongest. The trial took place in Schenectady in 1987, and here the case took a turn that still generates debate today. The jury convicted Mary Beth Tinning of murder in the 2nd degree, but they did so under a theory of depraved indifference to human life, rather than finding that she had specifically intended to kill her daughter. In plain terms, the jury agreed she had caused the death through an act of monstrous disregard, but stopped short of declaring that she had set out that day meaning to end her child's life. It is a legal distinction that has followed the case ever since, and it is worth being honest about. She was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. What hangs over the conviction, of course, are the other 8 children. Investigators and medical experts who reviewed the pattern came to believe that the earlier deaths were almost certainly not the coincidences they had once seemed. But the passage of time, the state of the old evidence, and the sheer difficulty of proving decades-old cases meant that Tinning was never tried for them. She answered, in a legal sense, for 1 death out of 9. Mary Beth Tinning served roughly 31 years behind bars. She was denied parole 6 separate times as the years wore on. Then, in 2018, on her 7th attempt, a parole board granted her release, and she walked out of prison an old woman. She was fully discharged from supervision a few years after that, and in a final twist, she took back her confession. After years inside, she recanted, claiming she had been pressured into admitting things she did not do, and denying that she had ever harmed any of her children. The case became one of the most studied in the grim literature of mothers who kill, examined in books and cited for decades in discussions of how such a thing could possibly go unnoticed for so long. She was, by every outward appearance, an ordinary woman in an ordinary town, and that very ordinariness is part of what let the deaths pass without question for so long. Because that is the part that truly unsettles. 9 children died over the span of 14 years, each death mourned, each one accepted, each tiny coffin lowered while the woman standing over it already knew, at least some of the time, exactly what had happened. The signs were there the whole while, spread across more than a decade, and no one let themselves see them until only 1 child was left to save, and even she was already gone. 9 children, 1 mother at every graveside. And a truth that took 14 years and 8 lost sons and daughters before a single person was willing to say it. 10 women and 1 thread running through all of them. The person these children should have been safest with turned out to be the one they needed protecting from. Subscribe, it is free and it keeps these investigations coming, and we will see you on the next case.